They said progress was unstoppable, that money and power could wipe away any trace of history. But what they didn't say was how much hate fueled it, how deep racism cut when an all-white HOA marched onto land that didn't belong to them, land that had been fought for, bled for, and preserved by a black family for more than a century, only to be dismissed as worthless dirt the moment the developers set their sights on profit. To the HOA, this family's legacy was an obstacle, an irritation, a problem that could be bulldozed into silence. And so they mocked their protests, belittled their history, and pushed them aside with paperwork laced in lies, convinced their wealth and influence could bury the truth forever. The family warned them, pleaded with them, reminded them that this land was not only sacred but bound by protections, left by ancestors who knew greed and hatred would one day come for what was rightfully theirs. But the HOA laughed, sneering that old black stories held no weight in the modern world. They built anyway to 156 shining white homes, standing like monuments to arrogance, their backyards stretching over stolen graves and ignored warnings, their foundations laid on the bones of history. But what they didn't realize was that every nail, every brick, every wall stood on top of a trap, a silent reckoning designed long ago by people who refused to be erased. At first, it seemed like coincidence, cracks in driveways, paperwork disputes, deeds, resurfacing from dusty courthouses. But slowly, it became clear, this was no accident, no random collapse of fortune, but a design, a deliberate inheritance of justice that could not be outrun. This isn't just about houses or land, it's about the collision of arrogance and survival, of a racist system that believed it could steal forever, and a family whose ancestors whispered from the ground itself, "We will not be forgotten." And as the HOA's empire begins to unravel, what unfolds is not only a story of injustice, but of vengeance. History clawing its way back to the surface, to expose the rot of greed and the ugliness of racism, leaving us to ask the question, when hate builds its foundations on stolen ground, how long before the earth itself takes them back? The land stretched wide beneath the southern sun, rolling fields of oak and pine that had stood through wars, storms, and centuries of quiet endurance. But to the Morgan family, it was far more than soil and trees. It was legacy, a rare inheritance of freedom carved out by a black great-grandfather who, against every odd, had purchased it during Reconstruction when few men of his color could dream of owning anything at all. For generations, the Morgans had guarded this land, working it, honoring it, and holding it as proof that no system, no hatred, no law designed to chain them down could erase their existence. And every boundary line had been stitched with sweat, sacrifice, and an unspoken promise that it would never fall into the hands of those who mocked them for daring to keep it. Their modest farmhouse sat in the center, weathered but proud, and though the family never had the riches of the townsfolk who looked down on them, they had something more precious: history. Yet, as the nearby town expanded, whispers grew louder that the land was underdeveloped, that it was being wasted in the hands of a black family. And the local HOA, a powerful board of wealthy white developers who believed they could turn everything into profit, began circling like vultures, eyeing the Morgans' acres as prime real estate for their new planned community. The meetings were never kind, never respectful. Each time the Morgans showed up to defend their rights, they were met with cold stares, mocking laughter, and paperwork stacked high with terms meant to confuse, humiliate, and discourage them. "It's just business," the board would say. But the sneers in their eyes betrayed the truth. This wasn't just business. It was contempt for a black family who dared to stand in the way of progress, defined only by white ambition. The Morgans knew they were fighting against a wall of money and power. But still, they resisted, clinging to old deeds, family journals, and records that proved their ownership was unshakable. Though every time they walked into that boardroom, they could feel the weight of history pressing against them, reminding them how often black families had been stripped of their land through lies and intimidation. The HOA made threats disguised as offers, lowball deals framed as opportunities. And when those failed, they turned to ridicule, calling the Morgans obstinate and uneducated, accusing them of holding back progress. Yet, underneath the ridicule was something darker. The board never admitted it. But their hatred was not only for the Morgans' refusal to sell, but for the fact that a black family had held land this long, had kept their ground while so many others had been forced to give it up. And so the HOA pushed forward, filing claims, cutting deals in back rooms, and eventually declaring victory, boasting that they had finally secured the rights to build their dream community, 156 gleaming white homes, a pool, tennis courts, and a gated entrance that would seal the community away from what they called the eyesore of the Morgans' farmhouse. Construction began quickly, machinery roaring over the soil, tearing down trees that had stood longer than the board had been alive. And every day the Morgans watched as the landscape of their childhoods disappeared, erased in the name of profit. But what the HOA could not see was the weight of something they had dismissed as meaningless: the family's history. The boundaries etched not only in deeds and papers, but in protections designed long ago by ancestors who knew that this day would come. And as the walls of the first homes began to rise, as the Morgans' voices grew smaller against the noise of bulldozers and the arrogance of the board, the ground itself seemed to hum with unease, as if history were stirring, waiting for the right moment to remind those who thought they could erase the past that the past was not so easily buried. The development of the 156 homes was not just construction, it was an invasion, a deliberate desecration of everything the Morgans had stood for. And as the concrete poured and rooftops climbed higher, the hostility of the HOA sharpened into cruelty so blatant it was impossible to ignore. Progress became a weapon to erase the black family that had dared to survive a century of systemic theft and prejudice. The Morgans' farmhouse, once isolated in quiet fields, now sat like an unwelcome blemish in the middle of manicured lawns, cul-de-sacs, and gleaming white fences. And every new homeowner who moved in seemed to adopt the same disdainful sneer as the board that had brought them there. Children whispered slurs across the schoolyard at the Morgan grandchildren. Homeowners scowled when the family drove past in their aging pickup. And neighborhood meetings were held not to address problems but to single them out as the obstacle, holding back property values. It was not enough for the HOA to take their land. They needed to humiliate them, to brand them as inferior, to make them feel small in a place that had once been wholly theirs. Letters arrived in the mailbox accusing them of neglecting their property, fining them for imagined infractions: grass too long, paint peeling, unfit structures, as if the house that had withstood generations was suddenly an eyesore unworthy of standing next to freshly painted, cookie-cutter homes. Neighbors deliberately let their dogs relieve themselves on the Morgans' yard, muttered insults when passing by, and complained that the family's presence made it unsafe for children to play outside. Though it was the Morgans' children who endured the bullying, each tactic carried the same message: you do not belong here. You never belonged here, and we will remind you of it until you break. Yet the Morgans did not bend. Their pride stitched into their very bones by ancestors who had known worse than this. And though the harassment cut deep, they clung to their land, their home, their history, refusing to be erased. But racism is never content with resistance. The more the family stood their ground, the harsher the retaliation became. The HOA petitioned the county to seize the Morgans' remaining acre under eminent domain, disguising theft as civic duty, and when the legal battle began, it was stacked entirely against them. Judges who shook hands with developers, lawyers who scoffed at their claims, courtrooms that treated them as trespassers on their own land. Newspaper articles framed the Morgans as stubborn relics, unwilling to accept modernization, carefully omitting the racial venom that fueled the campaign against them. To the outside world, the HOA was building community. To the Morgans, they were dismantling one. At night, the family sat on their porch, watching the glow of street lamps flicker across what had once been open sky, listening to the laughter of families who had moved into stolen ground, each sound driving the knife of injustice deeper. Yet through the pain, through the humiliation, there was something else, something unspoken, bound into the soil and the foundation of the house itself. The great-grandfather who had first secured this land had done more than sign a deed. He had buried a protection, a trap hidden in contracts, wills, and coded language that only those who carried his blood could understand. Generations had passed down the secret, always quietly, always cautiously. A whispered warning that one day, when greed and racism returned to take what was theirs, the land would answer. The Morgans had hoped it would never be needed, had prayed that the world would change enough to render such measures unnecessary. But as they watched bulldozers plow through their fields and heard neighbors spit words like dirty and undeserving, they realized the time was coming, and so they held their ground even tighter, attending HOA meetings where they were mocked and dismissed, filing appeals that were laughed out of court, refusing every insult meant to force them out. To the HOA, it looked like weakness, like desperation, like a family too blind to see that their battle was lost. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the Morgans were biding time, waiting for the trap to spring. The tension grew unbearable, with each day feeling like a wound that would not heal, yet beneath that tension was the weight of suspense. As if the land itself knew that soon, those who mocked and stole would face the consequences of generations of greed colliding with a history too deep to erase. And as the walls of new homes pressed closer, as neighbors grew bolder in their hostility, the Morgans endured, not because they were naive, but because they knew something the HOA never could. History does not sleep, and land remembers. The breaking point came like a storm no one saw coming, though in truth, it had been building all along, years of hatred, decades of systemic injustice, and a century of silent resilience finally colliding on a single night when the HOA pushed too far, their arrogance blinding them to the weight of history they had stirred awake. After months of failed lawsuits and relentless fines, the board voted unanimously to seize the Morgans' home, declaring it abandoned and unfit, a bitter lie signed by corrupt officials who had long considered the family nothing but an obstacle to progress. Flyers went out boasting of the demolition date, neighbors clapped in self-congratulation at block parties, and smug homeowners walked past the farmhouse with smirks that said, "Finally, they're gone." But the Morgans did not leave. They stood on their porch beneath the same creaking beams their ancestors had built, faces set in unshakable resolve, while whispers of their defiance spread through the subdivision like wildfire. That night, the HOA gathered with contractors and deputies, prepared to evict them by force, their flashlights slicing through the dark, their clipboards filled with legal jargon meant to justify theft. Racist taunts filled the air backward, "People, holding us back. Never belonged here anyway," the venom spilling freely now that they believed victory was assured. And then, just as the bulldozers roared to life and the crowd pressed closer, the ground itself seemed to tremble. Not from the machines, but from something deeper, something older, as if the land had grown tired of holding its silence. The Morgans' great-grandfather had not only secured deeds and legal protections when he first purchased the land 100 years earlier, he had woven into the soil a trap of law and legacy, burying ironclad clauses in county records, carving conditions into the will, and binding it with signatures from allies who had long since passed a web so carefully hidden that it took a century of greed to finally awaken it. The HOA's ownership crumbled in an instant, their deeds nullified by a clause that declared the land could never be sold, transferred, or developed without the unanimous consent of every Morgan. Descendant a clause the board had overlooked in their haste, one now resurrected like a ghost from the past. Deputies froze as lawyers read the hidden provision aloud, their authority evaporating under the weight of a contract older than their careers, and the bulldozers fell silent as the operators, spooked and uncertain, refused to move forward. But the land was not finished. As the crowd jeered and cursed, an unrelenting storm broke across the sky, rain pounding so hard it seemed to wash the streets themselves, flooding basements, uprooting fences, and cutting off the neat whitewashed homes from the safety of the road. The subdivision, once a monument to progress, became a prison of water and mud, while the Morgan farmhouse, built on higher ground, stood untouched, its lights glowing steady through the chaos. Panic swept through the crowd as cars stalled, lawns collapsed into sinkholes, and streetlights blinked out one by one, leaving only the crack of thunder and the stubborn silhouette of the house that refused to fall. Neighbors screamed about ruined property values, about losing everything. Yet not one paused to see the irony that the very family they had despised was the only one left, standing strong. The HOA leaders, drenched and furious, tried to rally their power, barking orders and spitting insults, but the rain drowned their voices, their authority dissolving with every second as the realization spread. They had built their empire on stolen ground, and now the ground had reclaimed its due. Some called it a curse, others muttered about bad luck. But the Morgans knew better. This was history speaking, generations of injustice breaking through the facade of civility, reminding those who had forgotten that land remembers its true owners. The storm raged until dawn, leaving the subdivision battered, its pristine homes scarred and hollow, while the farmhouse stood, as it always had, rooted in resilience. By the time the sun rose, the HOA's power was broken, their threats meaningless, their arrogance drowned in the very trap they had mocked as superstition. And as neighbors stared at the ruins of their ambition, at the devastation that had spared only the family they had tried to erase, a silence fell heavier than any insult, a silence that carried the weight of shame, fear, and the undeniable truth that racism, no matter how carefully disguised in contracts or neighborhoods, always destroys itself in the end. When the storm finally passed and the waters receded, the once proud subdivision stood in ruins, its manicured lawns turned to swamps, its luxury homes scarred by mud, mold, and silence, while the Morgans' farmhouse remained standing battered by wind but unbroken, like the family within it who had endured 100 years of scorn. For days, residents wandered in disbelief, dragging waterlogged furniture to the curb, blaming insurance companies, the county, even the weather. But deep down they knew the truth. Their downfall had been written the moment they tried to erase a black family's legacy in pursuit of greed. The HOA, once a symbol of power, dissolved overnight, its leaders humiliated in court as the century-old clause surfaced again and again like a blade cutting through every argument, every insult, every lie they had told. The Morgans, once dismissed as outcasts, suddenly became the only ones with shelter, food, and stability. Neighbors who had laughed at them, fined them, and spat at their children now lined up at their fence asking for water, for warmth, for guidance. Some begged forgiveness, some muttered excuses about just following rules. But the Morgans, though dignified, did not forget how easily those same mouths had once called them undeserving and less than. The irony was sharper than any insult. The people who tried to erase their existence were now forced to depend on the very family they had hated. And yet, the Morgans did not revel in revenge. They stood tall, not because the land had cursed their enemies, but because they had honored it, protected it, and passed it down with care, their quiet endurance becoming a weapon stronger than hate. Still, the sting of racism lingered, as it always did, whispering in the hushed apologies of neighbors who wished only to erase their guilt, not their prejudice, in the way officials rushed to call the storm an act of God rather than acknowledge the act of history. For the Morgans, the takeaway was clear. Their ancestors had not survived chains, whips, and exile only for their children to be erased by paperwork and bulldozers. They had planted a defense, stronger than fences, a truth, etched into the soil, bound in law, sealed by resilience, and that truth had risen when needed most. The farmhouse became a living monument, not just of survival, but of quiet resistance. Proof that no storm, no law, and no amount of hatred could destroy what was built with love, sweat, and sacrifice. And as the Morgans watched the neighborhood struggle to rebuild, they asked themselves the same question their ancestors once did. How many times must black families prove their worth, their right to simply exist on land they own, before the world accepts it without condition? That question, heavy and unanswered, is the echo this story leaves behind, because the tragedy is not just what happened in this one neighborhood, but that it has happened across generations, across states, across centuries. Families erased, legacies stolen, histories buried, and yet still, like the Morgans, some endure. The moral was not vengeance, but remembrance. That racism may build its houses on sand, but truth, though buried, always finds its way back, and when it does, it drowns injustice in its wake. And so, the story of the Morgans is not merely about land or houses, but about a century of defiance, a reminder that survival itself is resistance, and that justice, though slow, comes like a storm, relentless, cleansing, unforgettable. As the screen fades, remember this: racism does not vanish because it is inconvenient to acknowledge, and history does not forgive simply because the guilty move on. The land remembers, the families remember, the truth remembers, and the question left for us, for every viewer, is this: will we? For over a century, the Morgans held onto a patch of land in the deep south that carried the blood, sweat, and prayers of their ancestors, a piece of earth bought by a freedman who once said, "This land will be our shield when the world turns against us." But time had not softened the hostility around them. For the white families who watched generation after generation of black ownership seethed with resentment, muttering about how a black family could dare to keep something so valuable while entire neighborhoods rose around them. Until the inevitable happened, developers backed by the local HOA swept in, ignoring deeds, history, and rights, and began erecting rows of luxury homes, boasting of their exclusive community while painting the Morgans' farmhouse as an eyesore, fining them for imaginary violations, and harassing their children on the way to school. The message clear: they were unwanted, a stain in a landscape of polished lawns and whitened smiles. At first, the Morgans resisted quietly, filing papers, holding onto documents that proved their ownership, but the system was built against them. Their voices drowned out by lawyers, officials, and neighbors who twisted rules and mocked their complaints. Soon whispers turned to insults, shouted across fences, threats muttered in grocery store aisles, and sly smirks when the family was denied building permits or utility upgrades, as if the world wanted to grind them into silence. Yet what the HOA did not realize was that the Morgans carried more than just deeds and paper. They carried a century-old covenant written by their ancestor, a document that warned against tampering with the land, not a curse in the mystical sense but a legal trap, buried in the county records, like a coiled serpent waiting for arrogance to awaken it. And when the rains came, as rains always did in the south, and the river swelled, the trap snapped shut. Storm drains collapsed under the pressure, retention ponds overflowed, and the brand new subdivision was swallowed by water that rose with frightening speed, flooding homes, cars, and streets, while the HOA leaders screamed at county officials, trying to make sense of why their grand investment had turned into a swamp, only to discover in dusty archives that the Morgans' land, the very soil they had scorned, was the key to controlling the floodplain, a fact hidden in plain sight for a century. As the storm ripped through manicured lawns and marble countertops, the Morgans' farmhouse stood steady, elevated by wisdom and foresight, while neighbors who once spat at them now begged for help, their hatred drowning faster than their homes. Yet racism does not die easily. Even as they pleaded, many whispered excuses, refusing to admit their prejudice, blaming luck, weather, or fate rather than their own greed. The Morgans, dignified but unyielding, did not need revenge. The storm had spoken for them, history had risen, and their survival became the final word in a story written long before they were born. In the aftermath, reporters swarmed, lawsuits flew, and the HOA crumbled, its leaders shamed in court as the 100-year covenant resurfaced like a ghost, proving the Morgans' land was untouchable, untakeable, and forever theirs. What had been mocked as worthless was revealed to be priceless, not just in dollars, but in defiance. A symbol of what black families have always carried: endurance against erasure, dignity against humiliation, truth against lies. The neighborhood that once looked down on them was now broken, scattered, humbled, and the Morgans remained standing tall, not because fate favored them, but because they refused to let history bury them. And so the story closes with a question that echoes beyond this single family, beyond this single town: How many more black families must fight to keep what is already theirs? How many more legacies must be attacked, stolen, or drowned before the world admits that survival itself is an act of resistance? The land remembers. The families remember. History remembers. But the question remains,